A recurring historical phenomenon has led to the downfall of three major administrations within the past 250 years. Presently, in the year 2025, the United States appears to be progressing through this very same sequence of events, stage by stage, grievance by grievance, as if following a script written in bloodshed and turmoil. In 1789, France stood as Europe's preeminent nation, boasting wealth, culture, and advanced societal structures. Yet within a span of 5 years, its government was dismantled, its monarch decapitated, and the nation plunged into an era of terror that saw 40,000 individuals executed for political transgressions. Fast forward to 1917, Russia was a sprawling empire, ruled by a Tsar who presided over 180 million subjects. Having recently engaged in the First World War, the entire regime crumbled in a mere 8 months. The Tsar was executed, the Bolsheviks seized control, and a civil war and subsequent purges claimed the lives of 20 million people. In 1959, Cuba was a thriving Caribbean nation, attracting American tourists, boasting vibrant casinos, and possessing a functional economy. Within 2 years, Fidel Castro overthrew the existing government, nationalized all industries, and transformed the island into a communist dictatorship that endured for 60 years. 3 times, 3 distinct revolutions, 3 instances where seemingly robust governments dissolved into anarchy. Crucially, those in positions of power never foresaw these seismic shifts, believing themselves invincible, convinced the populace would never rebel, and that their established systems were too formidable to collapse. Their certainty proved to be profoundly mistaken on each occasion. Today, every indicator that preceded those 3 historical upheavals is demonstrably present within the United States. The chasm of economic disparity, pervasive governmental corruption, a profound erosion of public trust in institutions, and a simmering undercurrent of widespread discontent. We are not merely approaching this pattern, we are already entrenched in stage 4. History dictates that stages 5 and 6 unfold with alarming rapidity. This narrative explores the genesis of revolutions, elucidates why governments consistently fail to anticipate them, and presents the statistical evidence suggesting we are next in line. Before delving into the overarching pattern, it is imperative to grasp the true definition of a revolution. It transcends mere protest, riot, or political alteration. A revolution signifies the complete demolition of the established order and its replacement with something entirely new, often something considerably more dire. Revolutions are not precipitated by poverty, a condition that has plagued humanity throughout its existence. Instead, they erupt when aspirations outstrip tangible realities, when individuals believe they are entitled to a better existence than their current circumstances afford, and when the disparity between the ruling class and the general populace becomes so extreme that the fundamental social contract fractures. Most critically, revolutions occur when people lose faith in the system's capacity for self-correction, when they no longer believe that governmental bodies, judicial systems, or electoral processes can effectively address their grievances. When peaceful avenues for reform are systematically blocked, violent upheaval transforms from a possibility into an inevitability. These are not radical musings. They are the precise words uttered by John F. Kennedy. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. And the annals of history serve as irrefutable proof, time and again. France, Russia, Cuba, 3 distinct centuries, 3 divergent ideologies, yet the identical 6-stage progression played out. Let us examine their unfolding. We commence with the progenitor of modern revolutions, France in 1789. During the 1780s, France was the epicenter of European civilization. Paris reigned as the global cultural capital, and the French language served as the lingua franca of diplomacy. The arts, philosophy, and sciences were in a state of vigorous expansion. King Louis XVI occupied the throne, representing a monarchy that had governed France for 8 centuries, seemingly immutable and unassailable. However, beneath this veneer of stability, decay was rampant. This marks stage 1 of every revolution: profound economic inequality. In 1789, France's population of 27 million was rigidly stratified into 3 estates. The first estate comprising the clergy, owned 10% of the land and was exempt from taxation. The second estate, the nobility, numbering approximately 400,000 individuals, possessed 25% of the land and paid virtually no taxes. The third estate, encompassing the entirety of the remaining population, 26 million peasants, laborers, and members of the middle class, owned 65% of the land and bore the entire tax burden. Let that fact resonate. A mere 1.5% of the population contributed nothing to the treasury, while 98.5% shouldered the entire fiscal load. This inequity extended beyond taxation. The nobility enjoyed extensive privileges, including the right to hunt on peasant lands and demand forced labor. They resided in opulent palaces while peasants faced starvation. By 1788, a severe harvest failure led to a dramatic surge in bread prices, which constituted 88% of a peasant's expenditure. This doubling of prices rendered sustenance unattainable for many. Yet the nobility continued to indulge in elaborate five-course meals and host lavish fetes at Versailles. The disparity between the affluent and the common populace was not merely economic. It represented a complete detachment from reality. This introduces stage 2, governmental corruption and ineptitude. King Louis XVI, while not inherently malicious, was characterized by weakness and indecisiveness. France was financially depleted due to extensive military engagements, including its pivotal role in assisting America during its Revolutionary War, leaving the government indebted by billions. Louis's proposed solution? Further borrowing, increased taxation on the peasantry, and a refusal to implement any significant spending cuts. The nobility and the clergy adamantly refused to contribute to taxation. When Louis attempted to enact reforms, they vehemently opposed him, prioritizing the preservation of their privileges over the nation's welfare, even at the risk of national collapse. Does this sound familiar? By 1789, France was engulfed in crisis. The government was on the verge of bankruptcy. Its populace could not afford basic sustenance, and Louis convened the Estates General, a representative assembly that had not convened in 175 years. His intention was to legitimize new taxes, but instead it ignited the conflagration. This marks stage 3, the alienation and radicalization of the middle class. The Third Estate, which included not only peasants but also professionals such as lawyers and merchants, along with the educated middle class, demanded equitable representation. They sought a voting system where each individual possessed one vote, rather than the existing structure where each estate held a single vote, granting the nobility and clergy a decisive 2-to-1 advantage. Louis rejected their plea. Consequently, on June 17, 1789, the Third Estate unilaterally declared itself the National Assembly. They convened in a tennis court, vowing not to disperse until a constitution for France was established. This is the critical juncture where the middle class, the educated segment of society that ideally should uphold the established order, turns against it. When legal professionals and business owners declare a government illegitimate, revolution becomes an unavoidable outcome. On July 14, 1789, Parisians stormed the Bastille prison, a potent symbol of royal authority. They executed the guards, parading their severed heads on pikes through the streets. The revolution had commenced, and its escalation was swift. This signifies stage 4, the erosion of faith in institutions. The monarchy, the church, and the judicial system all forfeited their legitimacy. The National Assembly abolished feudalism, confiscated church properties, and proclaimed the rights of man. However, these measures proved insufficient. The radical factions continued to press for more extreme actions. This leads to stage 5. The revolutionary movement garners widespread support. The Jacobins, under the leadership of Robespierre, advocated for more drastic measures, including the execution of the king, the redistribution of all wealth, and the purging of the revolution's perceived enemies. They garnered popular backing because the moderate factions had failed to deliver tangible improvements. The economy remained in turmoil, food scarcity persisted, and the populace clamored for retribution. On January 21, 1793, King Louis XVI was publicly beheaded by guillotine. His consort, Marie Antoinette, met the same fate in October, ushering in the Reign of Terror. This culminates in Stage 6. The government is overthrown, and chaos ensues. From 1793 to 1794, the Committee of Public Safety, spearheaded by Robespierre, orchestrated the execution of 40,000 individuals, encompassing nobles, clergy, political adversaries, and even fellow revolutionaries deemed insufficiently radical. This period was euphemistically termed the purification of the revolution. In reality, it was mass slaughter. The guillotine operated daily in Paris, its public executions serving as macabre entertainment. The purges grew increasingly extensive, targeting first the nobility, then moderate revolutionaries, and finally anyone accused of harboring counter-revolutionary sentiments. Accusations, rather than evidence or trial, led to death. Robespierre himself was eventually subjected to the same system he had instigated, a stark illustration of how revolutions inevitably consume their own progeny. By 1799, France was utterly exhausted. 10 years of chaos, economic collapse, and widespread warfare had taken their toll. Napoleon seized power in a coup d'état, subsequently crowning himself emperor. The revolution, which had been proclaimed with ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, concluded with a military dictatorship that plunged Europe into 15 years of conflict. The overarching lesson from the French Revolution: extreme economic disparity, coupled with governmental incompetence and a profound loss of faith in institutions, invariably precipitates revolution, which in turn breeds chaos, terror, and often a new form of tyranny more oppressive than what preceded it. Let us now advance 128 years, to Russia, in 1917. By 1917, Russia was a considerably underdeveloped empire, governed by Tsar Nicholas II. The Romanov dynasty had held sway for 3 centuries, and Russia itself was an immense territory, spanning from Europe to the Pacific, with a population of 180 million. Yet beneath this imperial grandeur lay the familiar decay. This is Stage 1. Pervasive economic inequality. The Tsar and the nobility controlled virtually all wealth, while the peasantry, comprising 80% of the population, possessed nothing. Although emancipated from serfdom in 1861, most continued to labor on lands owned by nobles, burdened by insurmountable rents. In urban centers, factory workers endured 12 to 14-hour days for meager wages, with child labor being commonplace and safety regulations non-existent. Meanwhile, the Tsar resided in opulent palaces, and the nobility hosted lavish balls, the cost of which could exceed a peasant's lifetime earnings. The chasm was not merely economic. It was a deeply entrenched, medieval, and ultimately unsustainable divide. Stage 2. Governmental corruption and incompetence. Tsar Nicholas II proved to be an abysmal leader, characterized by weakness, indecisiveness, and a complete detachment from the realities faced by his people. He adhered to the doctrine of divine right, believing himself divinely appointed to rule, thus rendering any notion of reform unnecessary. When workers peacefully petitioned for improved conditions in 1905 by marching to the Winter Palace, his guards responded with gunfire, resulting in hundreds of fatalities, an event known as Bloody Sunday. This brutal act extinguished any residual hope that the Tsar cared for his subjects. Then came the First World War. Russia entered the conflict in 1914, and it proved to be an unmitigated disaster. Millions of inadequately equipped soldiers were dispatched to their deaths, led by incompetent officers. Supply lines disintegrated, and soldiers fought without ammunition. Entire divisions surrendered due to a lack of arms. By 1917, Russia had sustained 3 million casualties. The military was in disarray, and the economy was collapsing. Yet the Tsar continued to live in luxury, making critical decisions based on the counsel of Rasputin, a mystical figure who held undue influence over the imperial family. In February 1917, bread riots erupted in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. Women waiting in bread lines initiated protests, which quickly garnered the participation of factory workers. The army was deployed to quell the unrest, but the soldiers refused to fire on the assembled crowds, opting instead to mutiny. This marks Stage 3, the middle class and military turn against the government. When the armed forces are unwilling to defend the state, the government's tenure is effectively over. The Duma, Russia's parliamentary body, demanded Nicholas's abdication. On March 15, 1917, he complied, bringing an end to the Romanov dynasty after 3 centuries, not with a bang, but with a whimper. A provisional government led by Alexander Kerensky assumed power. They pledged reforms, elections, and a constitution. However, they committed a fatal misstep by maintaining Russia's involvement in the First World War. The soldiers desperately desired peace, and the populace yearned for food. The provisional government failed to deliver on either of these critical demands. This leads to stage 4, a loss of faith in institutions. Within months, the provisional government lost all credibility, perceived as weak, ineffective, and subservient to foreign powers. Into this power vacuum stepped Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. This ushers in stage 5. The revolutionary movement gains widespread popular support. Lenin articulated 3 core promises: peace, land, and bread. End the war. Redistribute the land owned by the nobility to the peasants, and feed the populace. These were simple, direct appeals. The Bolsheviks meticulously cultivated a disciplined revolutionary organization poised to seize power. On October 25, 1917, the Bolsheviks initiated a coup. They stormed the Winter Palace, apprehended the members of the provisional government, and Lenin proclaimed Soviet rule. The entire operation transpired in less than 24 hours and was largely bloodless, but the aftermath was anything but. This signifies stage 6. The government is overthrown and chaos ensues. The Russian Civil War raged from 1918 to 1922, pitting the Reds, Bolsheviks, against the Whites, a broad coalition of monarchists, liberals, and foreign interventionists. It was a conflict of unparalleled ferocity. The Bolsheviks emerged victorious through sheer brutality. The Cheka, their secret police, executed anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activity, leading to the annihilation of entire villages. In July 1918, the Tsar and his entire family were executed in a cellar, subjected to shooting and bayoneting, including the young children. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had consolidated control over Russia, but at a devastating cost. 10 million perished in the Civil War, with millions more succumbing to famine. The economy lay in ruins. Lenin's promises proved hollow. Peace translated to a humiliating surrender to Germany. Land meant forced collectivization and widespread famine, and bread signified rationing and widespread starvation. The revolution that had promised liberation ultimately delivered a brutal dictatorship. Joseph Stalin, who assumed leadership in 1924, would subsequently cause the deaths of an additional 20 million through purges and orchestrated famines. The lesson learned from Russia: when governmental incompetence converges with military defeat and a well-organized revolutionary force, the entire societal structure can disintegrate within months, and the subsequent regime is frequently far more oppressive than its predecessor. Let us now examine the most recent historical precedent, Cuba, in 1959. This case is distinct because Cuba was not a backward agrarian society. It was a relatively prosperous nation in the 1950s. Cuba boasted one of the highest living standards in Latin America. Havana was often referred to as the Monte Carlo of the Caribbean, fueled by tourism, casinos, and significant American investment. However, beneath this veneer of affluence, the familiar pattern persisted. Stage 1. Profound economic inequality. Wealth was concentrated in Havana and among the elite closely associated with President Fulgencio Batista's regime. The rural poor, particularly in eastern Cuba, endured significant hardship. The economy was dominated by sugar plantations, with a substantial portion of the land owned by American corporations, whose profits flowed out of the country or into the hands of a select few. Meanwhile, rural Cubans lacked basic access to healthcare, education, and economic opportunities. The disparity between the vibrant nightlife of Havana and the impoverished countryside was immense. Stage 2. Governmental corruption and incompetence. Batista, a dictator who seized power in a 1952 coup, abrogated elections and ruled by decree. Corruption was rampant. The police were easily bribed, and the judicial system was manipulated. Political opponents faced imprisonment or assassination. American organized crime figures operated the casinos with Batista's tacit approval, providing him with a substantial share of the profits. The government existed solely to enrich Batista and his cronies with no regard for the general welfare. Protests were met with violent repression, including the use of secret police, torture, and disappearances. This fostered widespread resentment, particularly among young, educated Cubans who witnessed their nation being plundered. Stage 3. The radicalization of the middle class. Fidel Castro, a lawyer from a comparatively affluent background, possessed the potential to be part of the elite. However, he was acutely aware of the pervasive corruption and opted for revolution. In 1953, he led an unsuccessful assault on the Moncada barracks, resulting in his imprisonment. Yet, during his trial, he delivered a powerful speech that inspired thousands. "History will absolve me," he declared. Released in a 1955 amnesty, he relocated to Mexico to strategize. In December 1956, Castro returned to Cuba with 82 men aboard a yacht named the Granma. They landed in eastern Cuba, only to be ambushed by Batista's forces. Just 20 survivors managed to escape to the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Most revolutionaries would have surrendered, but Castro persevered. This marks a point where the pattern accelerates. Stage 4. A loss of faith in institutions. Batista's brutal tactics alienated the populace, turning them against him. When his army razed villages suspected of aiding rebels, they inadvertently created more rebels. When police forces tortured students, their classmates were driven to join the revolutionary cause. Castro's forces grew not due to ideological appeal, but because Batista was widely despised. Simultaneously, the United States, which had previously supported Batista, began to distance itself. When a nation's foreign patron withdraws its backing, its downfall becomes increasingly likely. Stage 5. The revolutionary movement garners widespread popular support. By 1958, Castro commanded thousands of combatants, established urban resistance networks in every city, and secured the support of peasants who viewed him as their protector. Batista's army was in a state of collapse, with soldiers deserting and officers absconding with stolen funds. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled to the Dominican Republic, taking an estimated $300 million with him. Castro entered Havana victoriously on January 8th. This signifies Stage 6. The government is overthrown, and chaos ensues. Initially, Castro pledged democratic reforms, free elections, and an unrestricted press. However, within months, his true intentions became apparent. Political opponents were arrested, subjected to show trials, and executed. The press was systematically censored, and Cuba transformed into a communist dictatorship. Castro nationalized all assets, factories, farms, and businesses. Anyone who resisted faced imprisonment or execution. Hundreds were shot in the first year alone, and thousands fled the country. The middle class that had supported Castro out of antipathy for Batista belatedly discovered that revolution does not yield freedom, but rather new oppressors. Cuba remained a dictatorship for 60 years, with Fidel ruling until 2008 and his brother Raúl until 2018. The revolution that had promised liberation ultimately delivered poverty and repression. The lesson from Cuba: even in a relatively developed nation, systemic corruption and brutality can ignite a revolution, and the revolutionaries once in power inevitably become the new oppressors. 3 revolutions, 3 distinct nations, 3 separate centuries: France in 1789, Russia in 1917, and Cuba in 1959. Despite divergent contexts and ideologies, the identical 6-stage progression unfolded. Let us dissect this pattern. For once you recognize it, you will comprehend the profound reasons why the events currently unfolding in the United States should inspire considerable apprehension. Stage 1. Extreme economic inequality. In all 3 instances, wealth was concentrated in the hands of a minuscule elite, while the masses struggled. In France, the nobility and clergy were exempt from taxation. In Russia, the Tsar and the nobility possessed all the wealth. In Cuba, Batista and his affiliated elites systematically plundered the nation. While the precise figures varied, the underlying pattern remained consistent. When the top 1% controls between 25 and 40% of a nation's wealth, and the disparity between the rich and the poor becomes visibly insulting, resentment inevitably builds. This alone does not instigate revolution, as inequality has always existed. However, it provides the essential foundation. Check. Stage 2. Governmental corruption and incompetence. In all three cases, the ruling administration was perceived as illegitimate. France under Louis XVI proved incapable of enacting reforms and resorted to continuous borrowing. Russia's Nicholas II was demonstrably incompetent and detached from his subjects' realities. Cuba's Batista was a corrupt dictator. When a government exists primarily to serve the interests of elites, when corruption is blatant, and when incompetence leads to systemic crises, public respect for authority erodes. Check. Stage 3. The alienation and radicalization of the middle class. This is the pivotal stage. Revolutions do not originate with the poorest segments of society. Rather, they begin when the educated middle class loses all hope in the established system. In France, lawyers and merchants spearheaded the National Assembly. In Russia, students and intellectuals gravitated towards the Bolsheviks. In Cuba, Castro himself was a lawyer, and his initial supporters were educated urban dwellers. When individuals who should benefit from societal stability turn against it, revolution becomes a distinct probability. Check. Stage 4. The erosion of faith in institutions. When citizens cease to believe in the efficacy of elections, the fairness of the courts, or the integrity of the police, the social contract is irrevocably broken. In France, the Estates General transformed into a revolutionary body. In Russia, soldiers refused to defend the Tsar. In Cuba, it was common knowledge that Batista manipulated election results. When institutions lose their legitimacy, and the populace concludes that the system cannot be reformed from within, they seek alternatives beyond its confines. This represents the point of no return. Check. Stage 5. The revolutionary movement garners widespread popular support. This is the phase where organized factions emerge, offering an alternative vision. In France, it was the Jacobins. In Russia, the Bolsheviks. And in Cuba, Castro's July 26th movement. They promise justice, accountability for the corrupt, and a brighter future. Desperate for change, the populace supports them, not out of affection for the revolutionaries, but out of a profound hatred for the incumbent government. Check. Stage 6. The government is overthrown, and chaos ensues. This marks the culmination of the process. The old order disintegrates. In France, the king was beheaded, followed by a reign of terror. In Russia, the Tsar was executed, and the ensuing civil war claimed millions of lives. In Cuba, Batista fled, and Castro established a dictatorship. And herein lies the pattern within the pattern. The revolution rarely delivers on its promises. Instead, it brings bloodshed, purges, and new forms of tyranny. This is because revolutions are invariably led by extremists, and extremists are builders of destruction, not construction. The moderate elements who advocated for reform are either executed or exiled. Those who believed revolution would usher in freedom learn, all too late, that widespread chaos is a far worse affliction than systemic corruption. Let's examine the present condition of the United States in 2025 and the compelling indicators pointing towards significant societal unrest. We are currently in what can be described as the fourth phase. First, consider the extreme disparity in wealth. In 1980, the wealthiest 1% of Americans held 8% of the nation's wealth. Today, that figure has surged to 32%, a proportion exceeding that of France in 1789. The top 0.1%, representing approximately 130,000 households, now command more wealth than the bottom 90%, comprising around 117 million households. The chasm between the ultra-rich and the rest of the population is wider than at any other point in American history, surpassing even the Gilded Age and the 1920s. The affluent are conspicuously visible, with private aircraft, opulent yachts, and even space tourism as leisure activities. Meanwhile, the middle class struggles to afford housing, essential healthcare, and educational opportunities. Millions work multiple jobs merely to subsist. This growing resentment is palpable and indeed warranted. The second phase involves governmental corruption and inefficiency. Public trust in Congress has plummeted to 15%, and confidence in the Supreme Court is rapidly eroding. A substantial portion of the population suspects that elections are manipulated. Insider trading among congressional members is pervasive, and legislative proposals are frequently drafted by lobbyists. Corporations exert undue influence over elected officials, leading to governmental paralysis. Our infrastructure is decaying, and the national debt has reached $36 trillion and continues to escalate. Critical issues that demand resolution remain unaddressed because the government prioritizes the interests of donors over those of its citizens. When both major political parties are perceived as compromised and incapable, and when citizens believe the electoral system is rigged, faith in democratic principles inevitably dwindles. The third phase is characterized by the devastation and radicalization of the middle class. The American middle class is being systematically hollowed out. Higher education has become prohibitively expensive, as has home ownership. Healthcare expenses are pushing families into bankruptcy. While asset values skyrocket, wage growth has remained stagnant. Young individuals, particularly those with higher education, find themselves unable to achieve the same level of financial security as their parents. Burdened by student loan debt, they face insurmountable obstacles in purchasing homes and starting families, fostering deep-seated anger. When professionals such as lawyers, teachers, and engineers, who are typically expected to prosper, find themselves struggling, they begin to seek radical solutions. They search for scapegoats, identifying targets such as the elite, billionaires, and the system itself. This is often the genesis of revolutions, not among the poorest, but among the educated who harbored expectations of a better future. The fourth phase, which we are currently experiencing, is the loss of faith in established institutions. Public confidence in the media has reached historic lows. Trust in law enforcement has collapsed, and faith in the integrity of elections has been shattered. A significant portion of the populace believes the 2020 election was fraudulent, while another segment views the January 6th incident as an attempted coup. Neither faction trusts the other, nor do they believe in the legitimacy of governmental and judicial bodies. The courts are widely perceived as politically motivated, as is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Everything is interpreted through a partisan lens. When citizens cease to believe in shared institutions, the nation ceases to be a unified entity. Instead, it becomes two distinct populations occupying the same geographical space, awaiting a catalyst. France experienced the Estates General, Russia endured Bloody Sunday, and Cuba suffered under Batista's tyranny. In America, the trigger could manifest in various forms: a disputed election, an economic collapse, a political assassination, or a viral law enforcement incident. The conditions are ripe for unrest. We are merely awaiting the spark. We are in the fourth stage, and historical patterns indicate that the fifth stage is imminent. The fifth stage involves revolutionary movements gaining widespread traction. This has not yet occurred in its entirety, but the foundational elements are emerging. On the political left, there is increasing support for socialist policies, wealth redistribution, and sentiments directed against the wealthy. Conversely, the political right is witnessing a growing endorsement of authoritarianism, strongman leadership, and extra-legal measures. Both sides increasingly believe that the existing system is beyond repair and requires complete dismantling and rebuilding. When moderate voices lose influence and extremist factions garner significant public support, the fifth stage is undeniably present, and we are closer to it than many comprehend. The sixth stage is a prospect that most prefer not to contemplate, as it signifies widespread chaos. In France, the reign of terror resulted in 40,000 executions. Russia experienced a civil war that claimed 10 million lives. Cuba has endured 60 years of dictatorship. The notion of American exceptionalism suggests that such events cannot occur here, asserting our inherent stability, prosperity, and democratic resilience. However, similar assurances were made in France, and Russia was a 300-year-old empire. Cuba was once a prosperous and modern nation. All three ultimately succumbed to upheaval. This historical pattern is indifferent to claims of exceptionalism. The exact manifestation of Stage 6 in America remains unknown, but history offers us insights. Political violence would escalate, transitioning from isolated riots to organized acts such as assassinations and insurgencies. Law enforcement and military bodies would fracture, with some units siding with the government and others with revolutionary factions. Supply chains would disintegrate, leading to shortages of food and fuel. The economy would collapse due to a complete lack of trust. States might attempt to secede or reject federal authority, and foreign powers such as China and Russia would likely exploit the chaos for their own benefit, potentially prolonging the turmoil for years and resulting in millions of fatalities. The resulting America would bear little resemblance to its former self, potentially becoming authoritarian, fragmenting into regional entities, or evolving into something far worse. This is Stage 6. An historical precedent indicates that once a nation enters Stage 4, it becomes exceedingly difficult to avert further progression. Three distinct revolutions, French, Russian, and Cuban, followed remarkably similar trajectories. In each instance, the ruling elites failed to anticipate the impending crisis, believing themselves secure and underestimating the potential for popular uprising. In each case, the escalating disparity between the rich and the poor, coupled with governmental corruption and a pervasive loss of faith in institutions, culminated in an explosive dismantling of the existing social and political order. The United States currently finds itself in Stage 4. The wealth gap exceeds that of France in 1789. The government exhibits a dysfunctionality comparable to that of Russia in 1917. Faith in institutions has eroded to a degree mirroring that of Cuba in 1958. History suggests that Stages 5 and 6 are on the horizon. Perhaps reform is still possible before a full-blown revolution erupts. Perhaps the system can self-correct. However, the historical pattern and prevailing trends indicate otherwise. The warning signs are undeniable. 3 times this pattern has unfolded, and each time the involved parties mistakenly believed they were unique, only to be overcome by the inexorable force of history. If this analysis has illuminated your understanding of our current societal position within this cycle, please subscribe. When Stage 5 begins and revolutionary movements gain widespread support, you will need to grasp the underlying dynamics and their causes. The explanations are not in the distant future, but are clearly written in the annals of the past.